The following story time is 100% true. Now, this is a story about my own family, and although all the major people in this story are now deceased, I am going to change the first names in this story. My father had died in 1971 when I was 12. My mother was a widow doing the best she could, although her drinking had increased certainly since my father died. She was trying to do things that she never had to do, manage a household that she never had to do before, and it was a lot of pressure on my mother. My mother was third of 6 children in her family. There were 5 girls and 1 boy. The boy was the oldest in the family. Now, my mother and her brother were somewhat close as they were growing up, but my uncle being the only boy, he would often not be at home as they were growing up. He just didn't want to be around that many girls all the time. So he was out a lot. So my mother and he were somewhat close, not the best, but we did see them on most of the major holidays. My uncle and his wife had settled into a small town in New Hampshire. My uncle became a career policeman there in this small town. My uncle and my aunt had 4 children. They had 3 boys and 1 girl. The oldest son was named after my uncle. He was a junior, and he had always been a troublemaker as they were growing up. He was always in trouble, hanging with the wrong crowd, smoking weed, car racing. The basic things one does in a very small town when there's not a lot else to do. Now, my uncle, being a policeman, always had a lot of trouble with the fact that his son was such a terror. And he was often embarrassed that he was constantly having to bail my cousin out of trouble. Life in this small town for my uncle and aunt was very isolated, especially for my aunt. And during the years that they lived there, my aunt did not have a lot of friends. There was not a lot to do. She had to drive 25 or 30 miles just to be able to go to stores. And so how she passed her time was that she ate and ate and ate. And during the course of a couple of decades, my aunt ballooned up to 400 pounds. My uncle, who had always been a drinker, became much more of a heavier drinker as the years passed. My aunt, tremendously unhappy, tremendously depressed. And one day she was out at a store a couple of towns away, and she ran into a woman that she had gone to school with. And during their school years, this other woman had been very heavyset. And now here is my aunt seeing her after all these years, and this woman had lost close to 100 pounds. She looked amazing. And my aunt, 400 pounds, started conversing with her like, "I can't believe how great you look. You've never looked this thin, not even in high school. How in the world did you do it?" Well, this was the early 70s. It was long before any kind of weight loss surgery or even many of the weight loss drugs that have been around for decades. And so this friend said to her, "Well, you know how I did it? There's this new group that's recently been formed called Weight Watchers. And I joined Weight Watchers, and I was able, in the course of about 2 years, to lose close to 100 pounds. And my aunt couldn't believe it. "That's amazing. I can't believe you look that good." And the friend said, "Well, you know, I'm going to a meeting tomorrow night. You're more than welcome to come along with me. Now, Weight Watchers may not be for you, but why don't you at least come and listen and see what it's all about and then make a decision. And so my aunt did go with that friend to that Weight Watchers meeting, and my aunt embraced Weight Watchers. She couldn't believe that there was not only a diet plan that was working, but there were all these people, all these like-minded friends who were there to support each other and love each other and encourage each other to continue and push through and lose weight. And in the course of 2 or 3 years, my aunt lost an incredible 250 pounds. She looked amazing. And during this time, she started buying new clothes. The smaller she got, the smaller the clothes were. She started going out with friends from Weight Watchers. They would go out for low-calorie meals, and they would just be there in this friendship circle that just supported each other and loved each other. Well, my uncle, who had been a drinker and had slowly been increasing his drinking, started to feel somewhat threatened by my aunt. Suddenly, his 400-pound safe wife was now losing weight at an incredible rate. She was going out and socializing, and he began to worry, who else could she be socializing with? And so my uncle would work during the day as a policeman, and in the evening he would sit at home and he would drink, waiting for his wife to come home. Now, his wife always did come home, but she was very set on how she was going to continue to lose weight, that she was going to be the best that she had ever been in her life. Trouble continued to happen with my cousin, my uncle and aunt's oldest son. He was continuing to get in trouble with the law, and my uncle, as a policeman, was having to constantly fix things for him and begged him, please, I am a police officer in this community. Please, you're being an embarrassment. You've got to stop this. I can't keep bailing you out all the time. One evening, my aunt was at home, my uncle was at home, and he hadn't started his drinking yet. He had gotten home from work just a short while before, when the phone rang, and my uncle answered it, and he was told by his station that there had been a car accident in town. Could he please respond to that call? So my uncle put on his uniform, got in his cruiser, and he drove to the accident. And there he was horrified to see that his oldest son had been the driver of the vehicle, which was completely smashed into a tree, and he was barely alive. My uncle rushed, took him out of the car, pulling him out. My cousin had been cut and was bleeding, and his bones were broken. He was barely conscious as my uncle stooped down and dragged him out of his car. And then my uncle, holding my cousin in his arms, my cousin looked up at him and apologized for being what he called the black sheep of the family. And then, in my uncle's arms, he died. When my mother heard about this, she was beside herself. She had only lost her husband 6 months before, and now she was having to go to another funeral, this time for her nephew, who was only about 20 years old. So we all went up to the funeral and the services and supported my uncle and aunt as best they could. Over the course of the few months after this, my aunt continued to lose weight. My uncle, who had been so devastated, continued to drink, drinking more and more all the time, and was ticked off that his wife wasn't such a mess about it. She was continuing on her diet and losing weight, despite the fact that the family had gone through this trauma. And then, 6 months later, to the day, my aunt is getting ready for one of her social evenings. She had put on a new dress. that was smaller than anything she had worn before, and my uncle was sitting there drinking, watching her getting ready. She said she wouldn't be gone very long. They were just going out for a little dinner and then she'd be home. Please take care of your own dinner here tonight. And as my aunt was upstairs doing the final preparations for her evening, she suddenly heard a loud noise. Running down the stairs and into the bedroom, which had the door closed, she was horrified to discover that my uncle had taken his police revolver and shot himself in the head. When my mother and her closest sister heard about this, they just could not believe that this poor woman had lost her son 6 months before, and now her husband had committed suicide. So we all trekked up to southern New Hampshire, and we were there to offer support to my Aunt Margaret, who was barely able to speak. She just sat in a chair in the living room, crying, while all the family members gathered around her to support her. Now, my mother and her sister kind of stayed in the background of this group because the widow had her children and other close friends. Many people from her Weight Watchers group were all there to give her support. So my mother and aunt just kind of stayed back a little bit. They would talk to her, they would offer support, but they didn't want to interrupt the support that she was getting from her own close family. 2 days later was my uncle's planned funeral. And so my mother and her close sister and myself were driving up to New Hampshire. Now, my mother and her close sister were pretty much inseparable when I was growing up. And one of the things they did, one could say because they were 100% Irish and their parents had drank, their other siblings had drank, my mother and my aunt used to drink quite a bit. They would carry these pre-mixed drinks in their purses with them. And periodically, if they would go out for a day shopping or somewhere, they would pull over beside the road, open their little drinks, and toast each other and have a few. So this day was no different. My mother had been a mess during the 2 days since we had heard about this. My mother had lost not only her husband a year ago, not only her nephew 6 months ago, but now here her brother had committed suicide. My aunt said that she would drive us up to New Hampshire. My mother sat in the passenger seat with one of her pre-mixed cocktails, drinking away and just sobbing over the grief that she was feeling. When we got up to the funeral home, before we went in, my mother sat and finished off whatever drinks she had because she was very nervous. My mother was a very nervous woman. She didn't see the other relatives, other than this one close sister, all that often. So whenever she was going to see other siblings, she was always a little nervous about it. We were never a really close family. We were a big family, but it was a small group of us that constantly socialized together. So to calm my mother's nerves, she finished off her drink. She took a few breaths and she said, "Okay, let's go in." But as we were walking, my mother took my hand and my mother was shaking from nerves. We go into the funeral home and we go into the room where the casket is. It's a closed casket, of course. My uncle had shot himself in the head, so it was a closed casket. There was a big group within this one room where the casket was. All the family was on one side, many friends were on the other. People were whispering amongst themselves, and my aunt was standing in the center of the room, greeting people as they came in to offer their condolences. My mother and my aunt patiently waited for people to go past my Aunt Margaret. And then my mother walked up to her and said in a voice that was obviously too loud, but she had been drinking, so she probably didn't realize how loud she was being. And my mother said loudly and very clearly, "Oh God, Margaret, you needed this like you needed a hole in the head." There was a collective within the entire room, and my mother froze, and my Aunt Margaret's eyes were wide, not believing what she had just heard. And my mother's close sister took her by the arm and started to walk away and elbowed her and said, "What the hell are you saying?" And my mother's like, "Oh my God, I didn't know what I said." And my aunt's like, "He shot himself in the head. You don't say you needed this like you needed a hole in the head." So somehow we got through that service that was held at the funeral home. And now we go to the cemetery for the burial. And somewhere in the funeral preparations, the fact that my aunt had lost her son before, so she was very confused and probably not all there when she was making funeral arrangements. That's very common to run into. And forgetting that my uncle had been in the service. Well, back then, probably still now, but definitely back then, every single veteran's funeral had something at the conclusion of the funeral. So we're at the cemetery and the minister is saying his last words, and my aunt is crying and leaning against her daughter and her son, and my mother and her close sister were leaning against each other for support. And then, obviously that everybody had forgotten, suddenly these soldiers walked forward in procession and lined up on the other side of the grave. Beside them, they held rifles, and they got into position and they proceeded with a gun salute. "Ready, fire!" Boom! And my aunt just reels. She can barely stand up. Boom! Boom! My aunt is just dropping practically to her knees as they did this. And obviously the soldiers, were not aware of it. They had probably not been told anything other than the name and the rank and the years maybe my uncle was in the service. It was never discussed how his death came about. They wouldn't know that. And so my aunt had to deal with this gun salute. They were devastated. By the time we were going back down to Massachusetts, my mother and her close sister were basket cases. My aunt somehow drove. My mother was just collapsed in the seat, not believing not just the horrible thing that she had said to the widow, but the fact that they had to go through this gun salute, that it seemed like it just went on forever. But, you know, in all the stories that I have about being a funeral director and all the many stories that I have told you over the years on the podcast, and I think a few here on this channel, I have to say that what my mother said had to be the worst thing that I have ever heard anyone say at a funeral. I'll be back with another video soon. Thank you for joining me for this really bizarre story. Please feel free to leave a comment below and I will respond. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.